that. I'm going to leave the words up here for you guys as I preach for the most part, because it's a short letter. It's the shortest letter that Jesus writes to the churches, which is interesting because it's actually one of the most famous cities, and yet they get the shortest letter written to them. So I'm going to leave it on the screen for a little bit so you can look at the words that he's looking at. So this summer, of course, we're going through the book of Revelation, the beginning part of it, and these, what I've called love letters that Jesus is writing to the churches directly. He's speaking directly to these churches. And he's saying, I'm Jesus. And every church he goes to, he introduces himself in a unique way. And today, he introduces himself. He says, I'm the first, I'm the last, I died, and I came to life. And it's incredibly important that you know why he introduces himself that way. And at the end, he gives this church a promise, this church in Smyrna, this thing called a crown of life. And he's being really cheeky because it's Jesus and he's really cool. And he knows what he's talking about. So we got to unpack it, this crown business. What does he mean? Well, first of all, as we're going through these letters, there's 7 of them to 7 different churches throughout the summertime. We'll be looking. And by and large, Jesus, I call them love letters because he's imploring these churches as case studies to come back to him the way that they were at first. And sometimes he says really good things about the churches. And in the letter today, it's one of only 2 where he has nothing bad to say about them on the surface. And then sometimes he says some really bad stuff to them, other churches. And he says, get your act together, get it right. And I thought about it this way. I was not always the preacher that you see before you. I was in the business world. And I had these things, which I'm sure you have, which are lovely. They're called performance reviews. Don't you love this? Once a year or so, or every 2 times a year, you have to sit down with the person who's your boss, and they tell you all the good things you've done. And you're like, great. They tell you all the projects that you hit a home run on. All the things you're doing well, and you're like, really, really good. And then there's that one section called areas for development. Oh, that one. It's where they tell you all the things that you need to improve on, all the things you need to get better at. And it's sometimes very painful, depending upon your personality type. If you're an introvert, extrovert, vice versa. Whether you can deal with that, where you can deal with criticism, but it's incredibly important. Because in all my time in business, over a decade plus, I can tell you this, I can remember all the bad things that my boss has said about me that I needed to fix. And I can't remember much of the good things. Isn't that weird how the human brain works? And in a lot of ways, Jesus is giving performance reviews to these churches. And it's incumbent upon us to then take these reviews, these case studies, and say, what is he saying to us as a church, as a community? And if you don't call Soul Grace your home church, that's fine. What does he mean for us as a church as a whole, by and large? Where's our performance review? Well, here, the case of Smyrna tonight. And like I said, he doesn't say anything's wrong with them per se. Actually, they're not, remember last week in Ephesus, we saw that they've lost their love for Jesus. They were doing everything right on the surface. They looked good as a church, and they were hitting home runs. They had the greatest pastors and the greatest programs, and they were growing in one of the biggest cities. And yet Jesus comes to them and says, you've lost your love. He doesn't say that to Smyrna. They're in love with him still. They're faithful. They're diligent. They're responsible. And even in the midst of persecution, they've kept their chin up. So what's the problem? Well, here it is. On the surface, you and I would look at Smyrna tonight, this case study of this church, and we'd say, well, this isn't like Ephesus last week. They still have love. So what's wrong with them, Pastor? What's the problem? And Jesus is in essence saying, because of your love, because of your faithfulness, you're going to suffer. And that doesn't seem fair on the surface. I'll break it down in a little bit of why there would be suffering for a church that's doing nothing wrong. But you see, he's saying, in essence, because of your suffering, because of how faithful you are, you will suffer. You'll go through tests. You'll go through trials. You'll go through tribulations. They get the exact opposite of what you and I think they deserve. And there's this little phrase in there where he says, you'll be thrown in jail for 10 days. we don't believe that they're actually going to be thrown in jail for 10 days. I mean, most of you are like, jail for 10 days, that doesn't sound like a whole big deal. I don't know if jail sounds like a big deal for you for 10 days. But actually, the book of Revelation, you must know, is ripe with symbolism and numbers. 7s and 21s and 3s and 10. Let me give you a translation. 10 just means total. It means total. Jesus is coming to them and he's saying, you're faithful, good. Now you are going to be totally tested. See, this church in Smyrna, unlike the church in Ephesus, still finds Jesus beautiful. But now Jesus is going to come to them and say, what happens when you don't find me useful? You find me beautiful, but what happens when my usefulness for you wears off? And it's more convenient for you to forget me. This is the lesson for Smyrna. And he has this interesting thing at the end, this crown of life thing. Let me explain something about Smyrna. Little history lesson for you. This city, like I said, it's the shortest of all the letters in the book of Revelation written to the cities. Yet, Smyrna, we know, is one of the most famous of the cities. And it looks something like this, we think. This would be an aerial picture of it. Now, let me ask you, what do you see here? Little lesson here with my red light. Can you see? What does that look like to you? Anything? Anything? Bueller? A crown. Smyrna was known as the crown city of Asia. That was their nickname. It was on their coins. Their Acropolis, the temples on top, formed a crown, and they were incredibly proud about this as a city. They were known for being rich. Jesus mentions this in his letter. He says, you're rich. You're well off. You're well-to-do. And everybody in Smyrna looked at that crown, and they vied for what they called the first city of Asia title. They were called the crown city, but they wanted to be called the first city. They had enormous pride in their crown. The physical, geographical crown. This is why Jesus is needling home to them tonight. You're going to suffer, he was saying. And in essence, through it, you'll find where your crown really is. They're rich. They're doing well. There's no criticism of them. Yet they're going to suffer. And through their suffering, Jesus says, at the end of it all, I'll give you a crown of life as opposed to the crown that you've come to embrace. Let's look at this tonight. Look at the suffering that they endure, that they're going to endure, what it means for them, and how it's going to expose the real crown, where they find their value, where they find their comfort, their security, their name, their dignity, their regalness. And then what Jesus offers them in the gospel. First, what kind of suffering are they going through? See, the last few weeks I've told you that these guys in the Roman Empire at the time were being persecuted. They were being put on sticks, and they were being lit on fire, and they were being fed to the lions. And I'm looking at you, and I know that I don't think any of you have that fear tonight. I really hope you don't. I don't think any of you fear that when you go home you'll be impaled this evening. And I don't think any of you fear that when you go home you're going to be suffered and have to be thrown to the lions. And so you say, they have nothing in common with me. Whoa, hold on. There's this tricky little verse in verse 9, if you go back. And it says, there's people there who say they're Jews, but they're not. They're synagogue of Satan. And oh my goodness, for so many years, this has been so misinterpreted as being anti-Semitic, and that's not what he's saying at all. Because we know this, historically speaking, that when you're in a Roman prefecture or a Roman city, and if you were Jewish, you could apply for certain exemptions, religious exemptions, that would say you don't have to worship the emperor. You don't have to go pay the emperor tax at the temple. You have exemptions from certain military services we know at the time. Because you could say, well, I'm a follower of Judaism, and you're exempt. But what historians note around this time, and especially around this area in Asia Minor, what was happening was this. People were converting to this new thing called Christianity. And their neighbors and their family members were looking at them and saying, if you convert, I'm threatened. You see this? The people who were converting meant that they'd put their family in jeopardy. They were no longer exempt, or possibly speaking, they could be persecuted just like everybody else. And they were afraid of it. And this is why he says, there's some people who say they're Jews, but they're not, meaning this. They're losing out. And they're going to turn their backs on you. They're losing out. And they're going to lie about you and sell you down the river. You see, it is so much different, and so much deeper, and it's so much nuanced, and so much more subversive than being put on a pole. Their livelihoods were being threatened. Their families were being threatened. God, in a certain sense, had ceased to be useful. And this was their suffering. Many people in the Jewish community were betraying their people that they called friends and the families. There were things pulling people away from their belief as Christians. See, let's dig deeper. What's going on here is that it's not any more economically beneficial for people to be calling themselves Christians. It's not socially beneficial for them to call themselves Christians. They would have lost their businesses, their friends, their families. People turned their backs on them at the time. This is the suffering that they're going through. Yeah, they may have been thrown in jail, most likely and quite possibly. But more than that, what God is saying to them is, I'm going to cease to be useful to you. What will you do then? What will you do when culture says, don't follow me? What will you do when society says, go this way, not that way? What will you do when your very friends and your very family turn on you because you believe in me? What will you do? What crown will you wear? What are you going to do, Smyrna? What are you going to do, church? In essence, see why I showed that picture. Smyrna, as a city, they found their wealth in that crown. They found their value in that crown. If you had to talk to somebody in Smyrna at the time, they would have said, look at our crown. That's why we're important. We're the first city of Asia. We're the crown city of Asia. They took enormous pride in that. And through their suffering, Jesus is in essence saying, if you put anything above me, friends, family, ambition, career, co-workers, whatever it may be, that's your crown. And when suffering comes, you'll find out where your crown really is. Let me illustrate it this way. For those of you who are tea drinkers, we got tea drinkers? If I give you 2 bags of tea and I put them in front of you, how will you know which one's good and which one's bad? You won't know. Maybe you can smell it, but you won't know for sure why and when until it gets steeped in the hot water. Until, in essence, the tea bag, for lack of a better word, suffers in the heat. Then you know if that tea is sweet or bitter. See, the church in Smyrna, why do they have to suffer? Jesus doesn't give an answer necessarily, but it is to reveal where their crown is. What are they resting in? Where do you and I find our glory? You and I, if we're honest with ourselves, go around putting crowns on our head all the time, do we not? The crowns of performance, giving a good sermon. The crowns of achievement, having a great family. The crowns of reputation and recognition. That's what that city was doing. They found their crown. And Jesus says, you as a church now, I'm going to put you in the hot water. Then I'll know if your taste sweet or bitter. Then I'll know if you have a crown of life or the crown of your own glory and achievement. It's a way to say, find your crown in anything else but Jesus Christ. And when suffering comes, that crown will be exposed. And suffering will come. This word that he uses actually in Greek is called thlipsis. It's a really cool word, and what it means is intense persecution, as if the image of a boulder coming down on you. And if a boulder comes down on you, you know what you're made of, do you not? I don't know. Have anybody had boulders come down on them? If a rock was to come down on your shoulders, you know how strong you really are. All your pretenses of strength are gone because that boulder weighs more than you. You can call yourself strong and equipped, but when the boulder comes crushing down, then you know. And this is what Jesus is saying to the church in Smyrna. You're going to go away for 10 days, complete testing. And friends are going to mock you, potentially. And family is going to abuse you, potentially. And coworkers are going to make fun of you, potentially. And you will suffer. And you will be pressed by thlipsis, and you will be pushed down with the boulder. You'll be thrown into the hot water, and then and only then will you know where your crown is. What's your true crown? Now, in suffering, I said this a couple weeks ago. I've been asked the question many times, why suffering? Jesus, you notice, doesn't give an answer as to why. He only says that. He's saying, if you're faithful and if you're true as a church, you will be tested. Culture will pull you away from me. Everyone will tell you he's not useful for you anymore. He's not going to advance your career. He's not going to give you comfort and happiness and security like you want. Find another crown. Go get your spouse, they'll be your crown. Find your children, they'll be your crown. Find your job, that'll be your crown. But when the suffering comes, the rock comes down, the tea gets hot, then you get exposed. What's the answer? What's the answer to this then? If Smyrna crowned themselves with glory and reputation, which, let's be honest, that's kind of what we do, right? Come on, it's church, we can be honest. We trump ourselves up. Crown us with many crowns. Us upon the throne. All our music drowns out everything else, unlike the song that we sang. So, how do you get the crown back? Well, look at this case study of Smyrna first, and then I'm going to apply it to you and me. These Smyrnans, these people, this church, was facing more than I dare say you and I ever will face in our life in terms of suffering. Financial loss, loss of life, loss of family, loss of everything. And I would look at you and I'd say, how dare you then go to them and say, have courage, don't fear. But Jesus says that. But look at the way he introduces himself to the church as a way to know how he says to get courage, to overcome fear, to get out of the hot water, to get out of underneath the boulder. Look at what Jesus says to them. He comes to them and says, I'm the first and the last. I died, and I know. Whenever you will go through suffering, and you will, whenever you feel like you're being tested for 10 biblical days, which is a long, long, long time, whenever you're in the hot water and want to get out, is it just a matter of summing up courage? No. It's the hearing of the one who says, I know, and I died. See, what's beautiful about this is that the Christian faith, Jesus himself, he doesn't give an answer to their suffering. You see this? He doesn't say you're going to be suffering because of this. This is the reason for suffering. This is the why. That's a very valid question. It's a very intellectually honest question, and you should ask that. But that's not what Jesus says as an answer to suffering. He says, I know. I died. I'm the only one, he says, who knows suffering the way that you do. And it's the answer. It's the answer for getting rid of fear in your life. It's the answer of going through the trials of your life, of surviving the boulders that crush down on you. It doesn't say in the book of John, 1 John, perfect courage cast out perfect fear. It says perfect love cast out perfect fear. You and I must know that he loved us if we are to overcome the fear of that boulder crushing down on you. And it may be right now that you're dealing with it, or it may that you've dealt with in the past, or it's going to be in the future, but it'll come on you. And you have a choice. Put your chest out. Just fight through it. Oh, it'll crush you. Or look to the one who says, I know. I died. I'm alive. And this is why, as an aside, in the story that you have with Jesus when he goes to his buddy Lazarus, some of you may know this story, and he comes to that place where Lazarus is dead, and everybody's sad. Does Jesus just look at people and go, smile, be happy? It says he wept, and that Greek word means he lost his stuff. He became a hot mess. I want you to think about that for a second. This is Jesus himself. He knows in about 2 minutes he's going to raise his buddy Lazarus from the tomb. And he cries. And he weeps. Because he knows. And he would die. And he would come alive. See, the church in Smyrna, maybe this church, maybe you, just as in your own heart as a Christian, you're going to get the boulders coming down on you. You'll get that intense persecution and pain where you think, I can't go on one more day. That's what it means by suffering for 10 days. When you say, I can't deal with this one more day, and God says, good, I've ceased being useful to you. Now know that I love you. I know. I died. I'm alive. And he ends by saying this at the end of the passage. If you look at this, and he says, he gives them 2 promises, which are really cool. And it's old language, and it may not mean much to you tonight, but let me try to make it mean something to you in the next couple minutes. First, he says, you get no second death. You get no second death. It's hope. This is the point of the entire book of Revelation. Most people read this book. I said this a couple weeks ago. Read the book of Revelation, especially if you're for more conservative churches. It's a way to say this is when the end of times is coming, and people have used this to predict when the end of times are coming. They've associated it with Hitler, to Saddam Hussein, to everybody down the line, and it's been wrong every time. Why? Because Jesus says, I'm not writing this book to tell you when the end of times is coming. I'm writing you this book so you know that when I come, you won't die again. It's a part C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce where he says, some mortals, they say of temporal suffering, no future bliss. No future bliss can make up for this. But they don't know that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into glory. Some mortals say of temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for this. The rock is crushing me. I can't go on. But he says they don't know that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. If you don't trust C.S. Lewis, trust Samwise when he says, is everything sad going to come untrue? Is everything sad going to come untrue? When Jesus looks at the church, you and me, and he says, you don't get a second death. You know what he's saying? Everything sad will come untrue. And it'll be all the glory more for the fact that it was sad. When the curse is lifted, the glory will be that much sweeter. When the tea goes in the water, it tastes that much sweeter. Because of the struggle, because of the suffering. Why suffering? I don't know. I can give you a lot of good answers, but I know this. He says, I'm back, no death, everything sad, untrue, glory comes, and it tastes even sweeter than if the pain hadn't been there to begin with. Now, what's the second promise? He says, no second death for you and for me if we hold him at the center of our lives. If we wait for him to come back. But then at the end, he does this thing where he says, I'll give you a crown of life. And I've alluded to it. I unpacked it a little bit. Let me press it a little bit more and press it out further. Because you may not take much stock in that this evening. But everybody who read this letter in that little town of Smyrna would have gone, oh, how dare he? How dare he say that? Jesus looks at them and in the most paradoxical statement says, you crown yourself with everything else in your life. You find glory and weight and significance and promise and hope and everything. When the rocks come down, will it stand? It won't. The crown will be crushed. And then Jesus says, but if you come to me, I'll give you a crown. And it's a crown of life. Why? Because Jesus got a crown of thorns. Almost every commentator you read points to the fact that Jesus is being a little bit, he's needling this home to them. This was the crown city of Asia. They were glorious, wealthy, affluent, smart, educated, well-to-do. They would have found their crown in everything else. And Jesus says, but if you come to me and give up your crown for mine, you get the crown you've always needed. The crown that says you're good, you're loved. And you know it because he lost his crown when he came from heaven. And he gets a crown on that cross. But that crown is a crown of thorns that you and I, if you think about it, in your heart of hearts, know we deserve it. He got it. This city was known for its crown. And it's a word play. And this is why Jesus is the coolest dude on the planet ever. Because he's needling them and saying, find your crown in anything else, and it will crush you. The expectations of living up to that crown of achievement, the shame you feel when that crown gets robbed from you, when the boulder comes down, it will crush you unless you take his crown. What's his crown? His crown was on the cross. He inverts the entire value system of this city of Smyrna, and he does it to you and to me tonight. He says, the world will put a crown on your head. You and I will put crowns on our head. But until we see him losing his crown, we'll never have an answer for suffering. We'll never be able to get through those 10 days when we say, I can't go on one more day with this. You can. Why? Because the ultimate boulder came down on him. The crown of thorns was on his head, not yours, not mine. The crown tells us that you're infinitely more broken than you ever possibly could imagine. And all the crowns you and I put on our head are tarnished, and they're dirty, and they fall off our heads, or they don't fit right, or we're constantly fighting to keep them on our heads, or we're constantly defending ourselves and lying about it to keep these on our heads, to project an image to everybody. That's what this city was doing. And he says, look, just get rid of it. Take my crown. Lose glory to find glory. Lose your life to find your life. Then and only then, let me say this, and only then will you have the most comprehensive answer to suffering ever. Why suffering? I don't know. But this is the only God who looks at you in your suffering and says, I know. I died. I'm alive. Take my crown. It's the lightest thing you'll ever put on your head, and it'll give you the glory that's heavier than you ever possibly imagine. It'll make everything sad come untrue and be all the more glorious for it. What's your crown built on? Where's your crown tonight? The gospel, the good news, says you get the crown you've always wanted but never deserved, because he got the crown that he didn't deserve, but that he wanted for you, pierced, bloodied into his forehead, suffering, crushed, so that you won't get crushed when the rocks come down and the suffering comes and the 10 days seem like 10 years and the 10 years seem like 20 years and the 20 years seems like 50 years. And you're broken and you're lost and you say, I don't know how I can get through this. He says, I know. I died. I'm alive. This woman, Martha Snell Nicholson, look her up. Wonderful poet, writer, Christian woman. Unfortunately, she lived almost her entire life from childhood into adulthood in immense pain. As a child, she had bouts of ear infections that were really bad at the time and bouts of pneumonia, and she suffered as a child, and she had a traumatic incident that made her spine grow bent as she grew up as an adult. And as an adult, she suffered many, many more illnesses. And she was bedridden, and in her bed, when she wrote poems, she wrote some of the most beautiful love poems about suffering because she knew it, and she could write about it. She went through it. And she felt in her suffering the enormous love of Jesus Christ because she knew that he went through infinitely more suffering than she ever could. And then she loses her husband as she's bedridden. And she writes this line, this poem that I put in your outline, as a way to say this about suffering. She says, I stood a mendicant, just means beggar. I stood a mendicant of God before his royal throne and begged him for one priceless gift which I could call my own. I took the gift out of his hand, but as I would depart, I cried, but Lord, this is a thorn, and it has pierced my heart. This is a strange, a hurtful gift which thou hast given me. And he said, my child, I give good gifts and gave my best to thee. I took it home, and though at first the cruel thorn hurt sore, as long years passed, I learned at last to love it more and more. I learned that he never gives a thorn without his added grace. He takes the thorn to pin aside the veil which hides his face. Brothers and sisters, there's no coincidence that the book of Revelation gives you and me this wonderful illustration of Jesus as our groom. It's a wedding. Why the thorns? I don't know. Martha seemed to have a much better answer than I did. I took it home, and though at first the cruel thorn hurt sore, as years passed, I learned at last to love it more and more. I learned he never gives a thorn without his added grace. He takes that thorn to pin aside the veil which hides his face. Do you see his face when the thorn pierces you? When the boulder crushes you? When the hot water boils around you? He's the only God who says, I give it to you with my grace because it pins aside the veil which shows you my face. I know. I died. And I'm alive, he says. That's your crown. Take it. Put it on tonight. Pray about it. Take a couple moments now and ask what it means to crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon the throne. All heavenly music drowns out all but its own. Go in prayer now.